In Shattered Trust, Rising Hope, Tyler Green, the mayor of Riverhill, finds his world turned upside down after a routine traffic stop leads to his wrongful arrest. What starts as a personal injustice spirals into a town-wide fight for police reform, where Tyler faces resistance, personal attacks, and the daunting challenge of changing a broken system. Will Tyler's efforts to bring justice and healing to his community succeed, or will the obstacles prove too great? The journey is filled with twists, triumphs, and moments of profound transformation. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that challenge and inspire. And drop a comment below. How do you think Tyler's fight for justice will unfold? Let's begin. The late afternoon sun bathed Riverhill in golden hues as Tyler Green sat in his office at City Hall, rubbing his temples after a marathon of meetings. As mayor of this small yet racially diverse town in the Midwest, his days were filled with resolving disputes, managing city budgets, and navigating political landmines. At 42, Tyler had the steady air of a man accustomed to responsibility. His quiet strength had earned him the respect of the community. Tyler glanced out the window, watching the last of the staff leaving the building. He imagined the quiet of his home, the comforting laughter of his two children, and the calm presence of his wife, Emily. He longed to be there, away from the burdens of leadership, even if only for the night. He grabbed his coat and briefcase, eager to leave the day behind. The sun was beginning to set as he walked to his car, the amber sky reflecting the peaceful stillness of the evening. Riverhill was often quiet in these hours, with families settling into their routines. The drive home should have been uneventful, but on this night, the course of Tyler's life was about to change. Tyler's thoughts were miles away as he cruised down Maple Street, replaying the day's discussions in his mind. He hardly noticed the flicker of blue and red lights flashing in his rearview mirror at first. A heavy sigh escaped his lips as he pulled his car to the side of the road, gravel crunching beneath the tires. He had no idea why he was being stopped. He hadn't been speeding or broken any traffic laws. He watched as the police cruiser parked behind him. There was no other car in sight. As the door of the cruiser opened, Tyler saw the silhouette of a tall, burly figure in the dimming light. Officer Adam Burke, a man with a reputation for being hard-nosed and unforgiving, stepped out. His stride was deliberate, his face unreadable. Tyler rolled down his window, offering a polite, "Good evening, officer." Burke didn't smile. His tone was clipped, lacking even a hint of civility. "License and registration." Tyler handed over his documents, confusion tightening in his chest. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" "I'm not aware of any violation." Burke narrowed his eyes. "You were driving too close to the center line." Tyler glanced at the road ahead. It was completely clear. No traffic, no hazards. "I've driven this road many times. I don't believe I crossed the line." Burke tapped the papers against his palm. "I'll be the judge of that." Tyler felt a pulse of frustration, but he knew better than to let it show. His father had always told him, "Don't argue with a man with a badge. You'll never win." But as a black man, Tyler had lived long enough to recognize the unease building inside him. There was something in Officer Burke's demeanor that felt off. This wasn't just about a routine stop. "Step out of the vehicle," Burke ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Tyler's heart raced. "Is that really necessary? I've complied with everything you've asked." Burke's eyes flashed with impatience. "I said step out." Reluctantly, Tyler unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. The cold evening air hit him as he stood by the side of the road. Burke's demeanor didn't soften. He moved to search the car without explanation, his hands rifling through Tyler's belongings with an air of suspicion. "What exactly are you looking for?" Tyler asked, his voice measured but tense. Burke didn't answer. Minutes stretched on as Tyler stood in the cold, frustration boiling beneath his calm exterior. Finally, Burke straightened up and smirked. "Nothing illegal, huh?" "There's nothing to find," Tyler said, barely able to keep the edge out of his voice. "Just trying to keep the streets safe," Burke replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "But I don't like your attitude. Let's go down to the precinct and sort this out." Tyler's heart skipped a beat. "You're arresting me?" Suspicion of resisting a lawful search, Burke said, pulling out handcuffs. Tyler froze. His mind raced. I haven't resisted anything, he protested, his voice rising in disbelief. But it was too late. The cold metal of the cuffs snapped around his wrists. The first emotional peak of the story hits as Tyler feels his dignity crumbling in front of him. His world, his authority as a mayor, his respect in the community, meant nothing in this moment. As he was led to the police car, his heart sank, knowing this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Inside the police cruiser, the reality of his situation settled in. Tyler stared out the window, feeling the weight of injustice pressed down on him. The car's siren wailed as they drove through the quiet streets, and he imagined the whispers that would soon follow. When they reached the precinct, Tyler was led inside in handcuffs. The booking room was harsh, illuminated by cold fluorescent lights. He could feel the curious eyes of the officers as Burke brought him in. Some recognized him instantly. Officer Olivia Watson, a younger officer, approached Burke, her eyes flicking between him and Tyler. "Isn't this the mayor?" Burke shrugged, indifferent. "That's what his ID says." Watson hesitated. "Do we have any real charges on him?" Burke's jaw tightened. "I'm just following procedure." Tyler's voice was quiet but firm. "You're arresting me for nothing. You've made a mistake." Burke's eyes flashed with irritation, but he turned away, leaving Tyler standing by the booking desk, still in handcuffs. Watson seemed unsure, but she followed orders and processed Tyler, though her eyes softened as she worked. She could feel the wrongness of the situation, but like many in her position, she was stuck between following orders and speaking out. After what felt like hours, Tyler was finally released with a citation. The charge, resisting arrest. It was absurd, but at this point, Tyler was too exhausted to argue. As he stepped out into the night, the cold air stung his face, but it was the weight of humiliation that hurt the most. His hands were still tingling from the handcuffs, and as he slid into the driver's seat of his own car, he sat there for a long moment, staring at the citation in disbelief. How had it come to this? A routine drive home had spiraled into an arrest, and for what? He had done nothing wrong, and yet the system had found a way to tear him down. As he drove home, the familiar streets of Riverhill felt foreign, as if the town had turned on him. What would Emily say? What would the community think? He couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that gnawed at him. And for the first time in years, Tyler questioned his faith in the system he had sworn to uphold. The first act ends with Tyler's world shaken. The emotional tension has been carefully built up, and the first climax, a man of power brought to his knees by an unjust system, sets the stage for the battles ahead. This is only the beginning of Tyler's journey toward justice. But the emotional stakes are clear. This isn't just about one man's arrest, it's about the deep flaws in the system that need to be addressed. The night air was heavy with tension as Tyler Green left the Riverhill police station. The cold stillness wrapped around him, but it did little to calm the whirlwind inside. Handcuffed and humiliated, the mayor of Riverhill had just been released after an unjust arrest. His skin still felt the burn of the cuffs, and his pride bore the deeper scars. Tyler's mind raced as he drove home. He had worked so hard to build trust with the community, to bring the town together across racial and social lines. But now, everything seemed fragile. He wondered what people would think when they found out. The whispers, the judgment. Would they see him as weak? He was supposed to represent strength, stability, and justice. But tonight, justice had been stripped away, leaving him feeling powerless. At home, Emily Green was waiting. She had been his anchor through storms before, but Tyler wasn't sure how to even explain this. How do you tell your wife that the system you've defended has turned on you? As he pulled into the driveway, he saw the light in the living room still on. The kids were asleep, but Emily had stayed up for him. Taking a deep breath, Tyler stepped out of the car and walked to the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. Emily opened the door before he could reach for his keys. "Tyler, what happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I was arrested," he replied, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "For nothing." Inside their home, Tyler sat on the edge of the couch, recounting the events to Emily. Her face shifted between disbelief, anger, and hurt as he described the arrogance of Officer Adam Burke, the unnecessary search, and the handcuffs. Emily's eyes filled with tears, not just for what Tyler had been through, but for what it symbolized. "How could this happen?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You're the mayor." "Doesn't matter," Tyler replied bitterly. "To him, I'm just another black man who didn't respect his authority." Emily stood up, pacing the room. "You can't let this go, Tyler. This isn't just about you. If this can happen to you, what does that say for everyone else in this town?" Tyler sighed, running his hand over his face. "I know. But what do I do? Fight the system from the inside? What's the point?" Emily sat down beside him, taking his hands. You've been fighting for this town since you took office. You can't stop now." He looked into her eyes, seeing the determination there. Emily was right. He couldn't let this go, but the weight of it all pressed down on him. The next day would bring more challenges. He'd have to face the media, his colleagues, and the public. He wasn't sure how much more he could take, but there was no turning back now. The next morning, Tyler's phone buzzed relentlessly with calls and messages. News of his arrest had already leaked, and it wasn't long before reporters were calling, eager for a statement. As mayor, Tyler was no stranger to media attention, but this was different. He had always been the one leading the narrative. Now, he was the story. At City Hall, the atmosphere was tense. Staff members looked at him with a mix of sympathy and uncertainty. Carla, his assistant, handed him a stack of emails, her usual warmth tinged with concern. "Everyone's talking about it," she said quietly. "The press conference is scheduled for noon." Tyler nodded. "Let's get through it." At noon, he stood in front of a room full of reporters, cameras flashing and microphones poised. His statement was brief but powerful. "Last night, I was stopped and arrested without cause. While I respect law enforcement, what happened to me is part of a larger issue that we must confront. Racial bias and police misconduct are problems that cannot be ignored. I intend to pursue justice, not just for myself, but for all the people of River Hill." The room buzzed with questions, but Tyler walked away, his message clear. This wasn't just about him. It was about the community, about accountability, about change. Tyler's statement sent shockwaves through River Hill. The community was divided. Some were outraged on his behalf, while others questioned the narrative. Councilman Robert Stevens, an outspoken opponent of Tyler's reform efforts, went on local news, claiming that Tyler was politicizing the incident for personal gain. But Tyler also had allies. Reverend John Matthews, a respected pastor and civil rights leader, publicly voiced his support. "What happened to Mayor Green is not an isolated incident," Reverend Matthews said during a televised interview. "This is part of a systemic issue that affects people of color every day in this town. We need to stand with the mayor and demand accountability." Local activists like Lisa Thompson, who had long been advocating for police reform, rallied the community. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForTyler and #ReformRiverHill. Protests began to form outside City Hall, calling for change. Tyler watched as his personal nightmare turned into a catalyst for a larger movement. The emotions that had weighed him down now fueled a fire for justice. But with that fire came a sense of foreboding. He knew this fight wouldn't be easy. The turning point came a few days later, during a heated meeting with Police Chief Henry Miller. Chief Miller was an old-school lawman, deeply entrenched in his ways. Tyler had worked with him for years, but their relationship had always been tense. The meeting took place in the chief's office, a room filled with trophies and photos of past achievements, a shrine to a bygone era. Tyler sat across from Chief Miller, who looked stern and defensive. "I've suspended Officer Burke pending investigation," Miller said, his voice clipped. "But let's not make this bigger than it is. It was a routine stop that got out of hand." Tyler leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "It wasn't just a routine stop. You know as well as I do that if I had been anyone else, if I had been white, this wouldn't have happened." Miller bristled. "We don't racially profile, Mayor." Burke made a judgment call. "He's a good cop." A good cop doesn't arrest someone for no reason, Tyler shot back. And if you think this is just going to blow over, you're mistaken. This is the tip of the iceberg. This department needs reform, and you know it. The room was thick with tension. Miller crossed his arms, his jaw tight. I'm not going to let you drag my department through the mud because of one bad night. Tyler stood up, his voice steady but filled with conviction. This isn't just about one night. It's about how you run this department. And if you don't take this seriously, the people of Riverhill will make sure you do. As Tyler left the room, he knew the battle lines had been drawn. The pushback from Miller was expected, but it didn't lessen the weight of the confrontation. Tyler was no longer just a mayor fighting for his own dignity. He was a man fighting for a community that had been ignored for far too long. With the police chief stonewalling him, Tyler turned to the community. He and Reverend Matthews organized a town hall meeting to discuss the incident and the broader issue of racial bias in Riverhill. The town hall was packed, standing room only, with people eager to share their stories and demand change. Tyler stood at the front of the room, listening to residents recount their own experiences with police discrimination. The stories were heartbreaking. People stopped for walking in the wrong neighborhood. Others pulled over for trivial reasons. Each story echoed Tyler's own experience, and with each voice, the weight of responsibility on his shoulders grew. Reverend Matthews stood beside Tyler, urging the community to come together in solidarity. This is our chance to make real change, he said, but we need to stay united. We need to push for reform, and we need to hold our leaders accountable. The town hall was a success, but it was just the beginning. The community was mobilized, but Tyler knew they needed a clear path forward. He began drafting a proposal for police reform, which included mandatory bias training for officers, the creation of a civilian oversight board, and stricter accountability measures for police misconduct. The proposal was bold, and it would face fierce opposition, but Tyler was ready for the fight. He had Emily, Reverend Matthews, Lisa Thompson, and the people of Riverhill standing behind him. The emotional tension of the past few weeks had shifted from despair to determination, and Tyler could feel the momentum building. As he looked out at the sea of faces at the end of the town hall meeting, he realized that this wasn't just his battle. It was theirs, and together they would push for justice. The town hall was the spark that ignited Riverhill. Tyler Green, still shaken by the events of his arrest, now felt the weight of something larger than himself. The stories of his neighbors, fellow citizens, and even some who had been silent for years flooded in after the meeting. It wasn't just about him, it never had been. He had become a symbol, and with that came responsibility. Back at City Hall, Tyler worked tirelessly with Reverend John Matthews, Lisa Thompson, and a small team of local leaders to draft a comprehensive proposal for police reform. Tyler's office became a hub of activity. His assistant, Carla, juggled phone calls and scheduled meetings as they prepared to present their proposal to the city council. We need mandatory bias training, Tyler said, circling an item on the draft. And we need real accountability. Officers can't be allowed to act with impunity. Lisa nodded, adding, and we need to push for a civilian oversight board. People need a way to file complaints outside of the police department. Reverend Matthews looked over the document. It's a good start, but we're going to face opposition. We need to be ready. Tyler knew he was right. The council would resist, and the police department, led by Chief Henry Miller, would fight it every step of the way. But the movement had momentum, and Tyler was determined to see it through. The day of the city council meeting arrived, and the council chamber was packed. The air buzzed with tension, and Tyler felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him as he took his seat. At the front of the room sat Councilman Robert Stevens, who had been vocal in his opposition to the reforms. As the meeting began, Tyler presented the proposal. His voice was calm but resolute as he outlined the steps for bias training, the establishment of a civilian oversight board, and stricter policies for handling police misconduct. The council members listened, their faces inscrutable, while murmurs rippled through the crowd behind him. When Tyler finished, Stevens was the first to speak. Mayor Green, he said, his tone dripping with condescension, I think we all agree that what happened to you was unfortunate. But this proposal, this is an overreach. Our police department doesn't need more red tape. They need our support, not to be handcuffed by bureaucratic nonsense. The words stung, but Tyler remained composed. This isn't about red tape, he replied. This is about protecting the rights of our citizens and ensuring that our police department serves everyone equally. Stevens scoffed. And what you're proposing will tie their hands. We can't afford that. The debate continued for hours, with Stevens and his allies pushing back against the reforms. But for every argument they raised, Tyler countered with facts, with stories, with the voices of the people who had been silenced for too long. Despite the opposition, the momentum for change continued to grow. Protests outside City Hall became a regular occurrence, with people from all walks of life coming together to demand reform. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Riverhill" and "Reform the Police" filled the streets, and the sense of unity was palpable. At the heart of these protests was Tyler, standing alongside Reverend Matthews, Lisa Thompson, and other leaders. His presence galvanized the crowd, and with each rally, the pressure on the city council mounted. One evening, after a particularly passionate protest, Tyler found himself standing on the steps of City Hall, looking out at the sea of faces. He felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. The movement was strong, but he knew the fight wasn't over. As the crowd began to disperse, Lisa approached him. "You're doing great, Tyler," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But we need to be careful. The more we push, the more resistance we'll face." Tyler nodded. "I know, but we can't stop now." The backlash came swiftly. Tyler's opponents, both in the council and in the community, began a campaign to discredit him. It started with whispers, rumors about his past, accusations that he was using the situation for political gain. But it didn't stop there. One night, as Tyler sat in his living room, a brick crashed through the front window. He and Emily rushed to the window to see the damage. A note tied to the brick, scrawled with hateful words. Emily's face paled as she picked up the note. "Tyler, this is getting dangerous." What if the kids had been here? Tyler's heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of fear and anger boiling inside him. "I know," he said quietly, his voice trembling with emotion. "But we can't let them scare us." The police were called, but Tyler knew better than to expect much from the investigation. Whoever had thrown the brick was long gone, and it was clear that some in the town didn't want to see change. The attack on his home was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Tyler received threatening phone calls, hate mail, and even confrontations in public. The weight of it all began to take its toll. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Tyler sat alone in his office at City Hall. The darkness outside matched the heaviness he felt inside. He had always been strong for his family, for his community. But now, he wasn't sure how much more he could take. His phone buzzed with another text, this one from an unknown number. "You're going to regret this, Green. We'll make sure of it." Tyler slammed the phone down, his hands shaking. The emotional toll of the past weeks had reached a breaking point. He felt as though the walls were closing in on him, and for the first time in his life, he questioned whether he could keep going. Emily found him there, sitting in the dark, his head in his hands. She knelt beside him, her voice soft but firm. "Tyler, you don't have to do this alone. We're in this together." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. I don't know how much more I can take." "You've already done so much," she said, her voice soothing. "But the fight isn't over. You have to keep going. For us, for the town." Tyler took a few days to recover, to gather his strength. Emily's words had grounded him, reminding him why he had started this fight in the first place. The attacks, the threats, they were just a symptom of the deeper resistance to change, and he couldn't let them win. With renewed resolve, Tyler called a press conference to address the threats head-on. He stood at the podium, his voice steady as he spoke to the gathered reporters. "I have received threats. My family has been targeted. But I will not be intimidated," Tyler said. "This fight is bigger than me. It's about justice, fairness, and making sure that everyone in Riverhill is treated with dignity. I won't back down, and neither will this community. The response was immediate. The press conference made headlines, and support poured in from across the town, and even from outside of it. Activists, civil rights organizations, and concerned citizens rallied behind Tyler, reinforcing his message that justice couldn't be silenced by fear. With the public support behind him stronger than ever, Tyler returned to the city council with the revised proposal. This time, the energy in the room was different. The pressure on the council members was palpable. They couldn't ignore the will of the people any longer. As Tyler presented the reforms once again, he noticed that even Councilman Robert Stevens seemed more subdued. The protests, the public outcry, it had shifted the tide. When it came time for the vote, Tyler's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that even if the proposal passed, the real work was just beginning. But this was the moment they had been fighting for. The votes were cast, and the room fell silent. The mayor's reform proposal had passed by a narrow margin. A wave of relief washed over Tyler as the reality sank in. The police department would now be subject to mandatory bias training, the Civilian Oversight Board would be created, and there would be stricter measures for holding officers accountable. It wasn't a complete victory, there was still much to be done, but it was a monumental step forward. As the reforms began to be implemented, it became clear that change wouldn't come easily. Despite the victory in the council, the police department was slow to adopt the new measures. Chief Miller, though publicly supportive, dragged his feet behind the scenes. Bias training sessions were poorly attended, and complaints filed with the new oversight board were met with delays. Tensions in the community continued to simmer, and then another incident occurred. A young black man, Jordan Davis, was stopped by police and treated aggressively during a routine traffic stop. The echoes of Tyler's own experience rang through the town, and protests erupted once again. Tyler felt the weight of the setback. Had all their work been for nothing? Determined to address the issue head-on, Tyler scheduled a meeting with Chief Miller. This time, the conversation was not going to be civil. As they sat across from each other in the chief's office, the tension was thick. "Another incident, Henry?" Tyler's voice was sharp, his patience worn thin. "How many more times is this going to happen before you take these reforms seriously?" Chief Miller's face was stony. "We're doing what we can, Mayor. But these things take time." "Time?" Tyler snapped. "People's lives are at stake. This isn't just about paperwork. This is about real change, and you're dragging your feet." Miller bristled. "I've been running this department for years. I know what works." Tyler stood up, his voice steady but filled with intensity. "What works is a system that treats everyone fairly. If you can't make that happen, I'll find someone who can." The tension in Riverhill reached a boiling point as the investigation into Officer Adam Burke finally concluded. The hearing was held in the town's courthouse, and the community gathered outside, waiting for justice. Inside, Tyler sat in the audience, his heart pounding as the evidence was presented. Burke had acted out of bias, the investigation revealed, and there was no legal justification for his arrest of Tyler. When the verdict was finally announced, Burke was guilty of misconduct. A wave of emotion washed over Tyler. It was a victory not just for him, but for the entire town. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted as the news spread. For the first time in weeks, Tyler felt a glimmer of hope. Justice had been served, but there was still much work to be done. In the days that followed, Riverhill began to heal. The protests gave way to community forums, where people could voice their concerns and engage with the reforms. The Oversight Board began to function as intended, and bias training became mandatory for all officers. Chief Miller, under mounting pressure, finally began to implement the changes more earnestly. Tyler stood at the forefront of this new era for Riverhill, his resolve stronger than ever. The road to reform had been difficult, and there were still obstacles ahead, but the town had taken its first steps toward real change. As he stood in the center of the town square, looking out at the diverse faces of the community he loved, Tyler knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but with every step, they were moving closer to the Riverhill they all deserved. With the police reform proposal now passed, and Officer Adam Burke found guilty of misconduct, River Hill entered a new phase of change. But as Tyler Green knew all too well, the battle was far from over. The real test lay in implementing the reforms effectively, ensuring that they weren't just words on paper, but actions that would reshape the culture of the police department and rebuild trust with the community. In the weeks following the hearing, the first round of mandatory bias training sessions began. Tyler made a point to observe the training sessions personally, wanting to see firsthand how the reforms were being carried out. The atmosphere at the River Hill Police Training Facility was a mix of curiosity and reluctance. Some officers, like Olivia Watson, a younger officer who had always been supportive of reform, participated earnestly. Others, however, sat in the back of the room, arms crossed, their skepticism apparent. The lead instructor, Dr. Samantha Caldwell, a specialist in bias awareness, stood before the room of officers. Her presentation was straightforward but powerful, focusing on unconscious bias, how it affects decision-making, and the ways officers could become more self-aware to better serve all members of the community. Tyler watched from the back of the room, noting the reactions of the officers. Some listened intently, nodding along, while others appeared disinterested, their body language signaling resistance to the new measures. After the session, Tyler approached Officer Watson. "How do you think it went?" he asked. Watson shrugged but smiled. "It's a start. Not everyone's going to change overnight, but it's the first step." Tyler nodded, knowing she was right. Change, especially cultural change, would take time. But it was a step in the right direction, and he was committed to seeing it through. Despite the successful start to the training, progress was slow. While many in the community were hopeful, there were still those who resisted. Chief Henry Miller had promised to enforce the reforms, but behind the scenes, Tyler heard whispers of officers dragging their feet, complaining that the training was unnecessary or an overreaction to a single incident. Tyler's frustration grew as he received reports of police officers missing training sessions or filing formal complaints about the new policies. Some even accused him of undermining the department's ability to do its job. One afternoon, Tyler met with Chief Miller to address these concerns. The meeting was tense from the start. "Miller, I'm hearing that some of your officers aren't taking this seriously," Tyler said, his tone firm. Chief Miller, seated behind his large oak desk, crossed his arms. "You can't expect everyone to fall in line immediately, Mayor. These are seasoned officers. They've been doing things a certain way for a long time." Tyler leaned forward. "This isn't about them being comfortable. This is about doing what's right for everyone in this town. The community is watching, and they're expecting real change." Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'll handle it." Tyler left the meeting feeling unsettled. He knew Miller wasn't as committed to the reforms as he claimed. But Tyler also knew that the pressure from the community would only continue to mount if things didn't change, and that could make Miller's position increasingly untenable. As the weeks passed, frustration within the community grew. While some officers embraced the changes, others openly resisted. Reports of continued biased policing trickled in, causing tension to rise once again. It was as if the reforms, though passed, hadn't penetrated the deeper layers of the department's culture. One afternoon, Tyler received a call from Lisa Thompson. She had been following the progress closely, and she didn't hold back when they spoke. "Tyler, we're hearing the same complaints we heard before the reforms passed," Lisa said. "People don't feel like anything's really changing. I've been talking to folks in the community, and they're losing faith." Tyler sat back in his chair, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "I know," he admitted. "We're hitting resistance in the department, but we can't give up." Lisa sighed on the other end of the line. "We're organizing another town hall meeting. People need to see that we're still pushing forward." "I'll be there," Tyler promised. The slow pace of reform implementation and reports of ongoing police misconduct led to renewed protests in River Hill. The town, which had been cautiously optimistic after the hearing, found itself once again filled with voices of anger and frustration. This time, the protests were louder, more organized, and demanded swifter action. At the front of the protests were community leaders like Lisa Thompson and Reverend John Matthews. The protests remained peaceful, but the tension in the air was undeniable. People were tired of waiting for change that seemed to be coming in half measures. During one of the protests, Tyler stood on the sidelines, watching the crowd. Signs with phrases like, "No justice, no peace," and "Reform now" were held high as chants filled the air. He felt a deep sense of responsibility for the frustrations that were mounting. Later that evening, Tyler met with Reverend Matthews in his office. "People are losing faith, John," Tyler admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm trying, but I feel like we're hitting a wall." Reverend Matthews, ever calm and measured, placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Change is hard, Tyler, but this isn't about quick victories. It's about persistence. You've done more for this town in the last year than most people do in a lifetime." Tyler appreciated the words, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't doing enough. What if the wall never comes down? Reverend Matthews gave a small, knowing smile. "It will, but it'll take all of us." Amid the protests and growing frustration, a breakthrough finally came. After weeks of internal deliberation, Chief Miller announced that he would enforce stricter attendance requirements for the bias training sessions and ensure that the Civilian Oversight Board had full access to department records related to complaints. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. The news spread quickly, and while it didn't quell all the unrest, it showed the community that their voices were being heard. That evening, Tyler received a message from Olivia Watson, the younger officer who had been supportive of the reforms from the start. "Mayor Green, just wanted to say thank you for pushing this through. Some of us are really starting to see the difference. It's not easy, but it's happening." Tyler smiled as he read the message. It wasn't the overwhelming shift he had hoped for, but it was a start. Just as things seemed to be settling, another incident shook the town. Jordan Davis, a young black man, was stopped by police and aggressively questioned for fitting the description of a suspect in a nearby neighborhood. The officers, not recognizing the bias in their assumptions, escalated the situation unnecessarily, resulting in Jordan being forcibly detained and humiliated in front of bystanders, despite his innocence. The news of the incident spread like wildfire, and the anger in River Hill reignited. People saw it as proof that despite the reforms, nothing had really changed. Tyler's phone rang nonstop as community leaders called for action, and Lisa Thompson organized yet another protest. Jordan's family reached out to Tyler directly, pleading for justice. The day after the incident with Jordan Davis, Tyler met with the Civilian Oversight Board and the Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. It was clear to him that while the structural reforms were in place, the cultural change that was needed within the department hadn't yet taken root. Chief Miller was present at the meeting, but his usual calm was replaced with defensiveness. The officers were following procedure, Miller argued, his arms crossed. "Procedure isn't the problem, Henry," Tyler said, his voice sharp. "The problem is the mindset that led them to believe Jordan was a suspect just because he fit the description. The bias training should have prevented this." Miller was silent, and Tyler took a deep breath before continuing. "We need to do better. I'm calling for a full review of the department's handling of the situation, and I expect the Oversight Board to have full access to everything." The tension in the room was thick, but Tyler was unwavering. He knew the community needed to see decisive action. In the wake of Jordan's wrongful detainment, the protests swelled once again, growing even larger than before. The town square became a meeting place for both the hopeful and the outraged, with residents demanding more aggressive actions from the mayor and the police department. Tyler attended every gathering, speaking directly with community members and trying to address their concerns. One protester, Maya Roberts, a college student and activist, approached Tyler during a rally. "Mayor Green," she said, "we've seen you fight for us, but the police are still treating us like we're the problem. What will it take to make them see we just want equality?" Tyler felt her frustration deeply. He nodded, his voice calm but determined. "Maya, we've made strides, but I know it's not enough. We're going to keep pushing until the change is real, until every officer understands what justice really looks like." In private meetings with his closest advisors, including Reverend Matthews and Lisa Thompson, Tyler began to reassess their approach. Clearly, systemic reforms were in place, but what was missing was the cultural transformation inside the department. They needed a new strategy. "We need more community involvement in the oversight process," Lisa suggested. "The oversight board is doing its job, but the people need to feel like they have a direct hand in holding officers accountable." Reverend Matthews nodded. "And we need to ensure that officers who don't meet the new standards face real consequences. It can't just be training, they need to feel the pressure to change." Tyler agreed. It was time to take their efforts to the next level. The final showdown came in the form of a high-stakes meeting between Tyler, the city council, and Chief Miller. The city council, divided as ever, was once again deliberating the effectiveness of the reforms and whether Chief Miller's leadership was adequate. Tyler, his voice steady but filled with urgency, addressed the room. "Chief Miller has served this town for years, but we cannot ignore the fact that under his leadership, these incidents continue to happen. We need a police chief who is fully committed to the reforms we've worked so hard to implement." The room went silent as Chief Miller, visibly tense, stood to respond. "I've done everything that's been asked of me, Mayor, but you can't change a department overnight." Tyler didn't back down. "No one's asking for overnight change, Henry. But we are asking for accountability. This town deserves a police department that's committed to justice, not excuses." The council members exchanged glances. After a long deliberation, they made the decision to replace Chief Miller with a new leader, someone who would fully embrace the reforms and move the department forward. It was a major victory for Tyler and the community, but the battle for justice in Riverhill was far from over. With Chief Miller gone and a new police chief, Karen Jacobs, a reform-minded leader, installed, Riverhill began to see real change. The bias training became more effective under her leadership, and officers who failed to meet the new standards faced disciplinary action. The Oversight Board, now bolstered by greater community involvement, became a central force in ensuring transparency. Tyler continued to meet regularly with community leaders, always mindful of the fact that the road to justice was a long one. The town was healing, but it would take time. The final town hall meeting, held to mark the one-year anniversary of the reforms, was filled with hopeful faces. Tyler stood at the podium, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and resolve. "We've come a long way," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "But there's still work to be done. This town has proven that when we come together, we can achieve anything. And I promise you this, we will keep moving forward until every resident of Riverhill feels safe, respected, and valued." As the meeting concluded, Tyler looked out at the crowd, feeling the weight of the journey behind him, but also the hope of the path ahead. Riverhill had taken its first steps toward justice, and together they would continue to build a better, more equitable future. Months had passed since the appointment of Chief Karen Jacobs, the newly installed police chief who promised transparency, accountability, and real reform. Under her leadership, the Riverhill Police Department began to shift. While the change wasn't instantaneous, it was palpable. The streets of Riverhill seemed a little calmer. The tension between the community and the police slightly softened. Tyler Green, who had led the charge for reform from the beginning, watched from his office at City Hall, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. His fight had taken its toll, and though the town had made significant progress, Tyler knew that reform was an ongoing process. The deep-seated issues of racial bias and injustice couldn't be fixed overnight, but with each small victory, Riverhill was moving in the right direction. As Tyler glanced out of the window, he saw a group of young children playing in the park across the street. It was a sight that reminded him of why he had fought so hard. His own children, Ryan and Sophia, would grow up in a town that valued fairness and justice, and that was something worth fighting for. Emily, his wife, entered the office quietly, her presence immediately soothing. "How are you holding up?" she asked, sitting beside him. "I'm doing all right," Tyler said with a small smile. "Just thinking about how far we've come. But there's still a lot to do." Emily nodded. "There always will be. But you've done something remarkable, Tyler. You've given people hope." Hope. It was a word that had become so central to his journey. It had carried him through the darkest moments, and now it was the foundation upon which River Hill would rebuild. The town hall was buzzing with activity as Tyler prepared for the latest community forum. This forum, unlike the ones held in the midst of the turmoil, had a different energy. People had seen the fruits of their labor. The reforms were in place, and while not perfect, they were working. The forum was packed. Faces that had once been filled with anger and frustration now looked expectantly toward the future. Tyler stood at the front of the room, alongside Chief Jacobs, Reverend John Matthews, and Lisa Thompson. The Civilian Oversight Board had also sent representatives, eager to share their progress with the public. As Tyler took the microphone, the room quieted. "Good evening, River Hill," he began, his voice steady and strong. "We've come a long way since we started this journey together. But this isn't the end of the road. It's just the beginning. Tonight, we want to talk about the progress we've made, the challenges we've faced, and where we go from here." The crowd nodded, and Tyler handed the floor to Chief Jacobs, who gave a detailed update on the police reforms. She spoke about the mandatory bias training sessions, the disciplinary actions taken against officers who refused to comply with the new standards, and the improved relationship between the department and the community. When Lisa Thompson took the microphone, her voice carried the weight of a long struggle but also a newfound optimism. "I know many of you were skeptical, and rightfully so. We've been let down before, but I've seen the changes firsthand. I've spoken with people in this room who tell me they finally feel like they're being heard. And that's something we can all be proud of." After several members of the community shared their experiences, Tyler closed the forum with a heartfelt message. "We're not done yet, but look at what we've achieved. We've shown that when we come together, we can make real change. Let's keep going." The applause that followed was louder than any they had received before. It wasn't just a show of support, it was a collective acknowledgement that their town was healing. Even as the reforms took root, there were still challenges. Not every officer embraced the new standards. Some within the department were quietly resistant, adhering to the old ways and waiting for the momentum of reform to die down. Others, especially older officers who had been in law enforcement for decades, struggled with the new expectations. One afternoon, Tyler received a report from the Civilian Oversight Board about a handful of officers who had failed to meet the standards set by the bias training. These officers had been placed under review, but it was clear that some were unwilling to change. Tyler met with Chief Jacobs to discuss the report. "Karen, we've come so far, but there are still holdouts in the department," Tyler said, sliding the report across the table. Chief Jacobs nodded gravely. "I've seen the same thing. Some of these officers are stuck in the past. They think this is a phase that will pass." Tyler sighed. "What do we do about them?" Jacobs leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "We continue to hold them accountable. If they can't meet the new standards, they'll face consequences. It's as simple as that." It wasn't an easy solution, but it was the only one that would work. Tyler knew that the fight for justice would always face resistance, but as long as they stayed the course, the change would continue to grow. Rebuilding trust between the police department and the community was one of the hardest tasks. Even with reforms in place, there were deep wounds that couldn't be healed overnight. Tyler and Chief Jacobs knew that the department needed to do more to engage with the community, to show that they were committed to serving all citizens equally. One of the initiatives that the Oversight Board recommended was a series of community police dialogues. These meetings would bring officers and residents together in informal settings to discuss their concerns, share their experiences, and work toward mutual understanding. The first of these meetings was held at a local community center. Tyler attended, wanting to see how the dialogue would unfold. Officers, including Olivia Watson and several others, sat in small circles with residents, listening to their stories and responding to their concerns. Tyler watched as people, who once would have never spoken to each other, began to build connections. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but it was a step in the right direction. At the end of the meeting, a young man named Jordan Davis, the same man who had been wrongfully detained months earlier, stood up and addressed the room. "I didn't think this day would come," Jordan said, "but I'm starting to believe that things can really change here. We've still got a long way to go, but tonight I saw something I didn't think I'd ever see. Officers actually listening to us." The room erupted in applause, and Tyler felt a swell of pride. It was exactly what they had been working for. As the weeks turned into months, Tyler found himself reflecting on the journey he had been on. There were still challenges ahead, but he could see the tangible effects of the work they had done. The town was beginning to heal, and the reforms were slowly but surely becoming part of Riverhill's fabric. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Emily, the two of them watched their children, Ryan and Sophia, playing in the yard. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over their home. "I never thought we'd get here," Tyler said quietly, taking Emily's hand. "You made it happen," she replied. "All of this, it's because you never gave up." Tyler smiled. "I didn't do it alone. We all made it happen." He looked out at his children, feeling a deep sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the future was bright, not just for his family, but for the entire town. As the anniversary of the reforms approached, the town prepared for a special event to mark the occasion. The event would bring together city officials, community leaders, police officers, and residents in a celebration of the progress they had made, and a reminder of the work that still lay ahead. The event was held in the town square, the same place where protests had erupted a year earlier. Now, the square was filled with people of all backgrounds, coming together not in anger, but in unity. Chief Jacobs, Reverend Matthews, Lisa Thompson, and the Civilian Oversight Board all took the stage to share their thoughts and reflect on the past year. Tyler, standing at the back of the crowd, felt a wave of emotion as he listened to the speeches. This was the culmination of everything they had worked for, and yet it was only the beginning. When it was his turn to speak, Tyler stood before the crowd, his heart full. "We've been through a lot together," he began. "We've faced anger, frustration, and fear, but we've also seen hope, resilience, and courage. This town has shown the world what it means to stand up for what's right, even when the road is difficult. And today, we stand here not as individuals, but as a community united by a shared vision of justice." The applause was thunderous, and Tyler felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had stood by him throughout the journey. Together, they had made history. The months that followed were filled with continued progress. Riverhill's police department became a model for other towns struggling with similar issues, and Tyler was invited to speak at national forums on police reform. His story, once defined by a single moment of injustice, had grown into something far larger. It had become a testament to the power of community-driven change. As Tyler continued his work, he never lost sight of the challenges that remained. He knew that change was a continuous process, one that required vigilance and dedication. But with each step forward, he felt more confident that Riverhill was on the right path. In the final scene, Tyler stood on the steps of City Hall, looking out at the town he had fought so hard to protect. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the town square, and as he stood there, he felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but Tyler was ready. Riverhill had proven that justice, once shattered, could be rebuilt, and with every step they took, they were moving closer to a future where fairness and equality were not just ideals, but realities. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey through Shattered Trust, Rising Hope. If this story moved you and you're passionate about justice, community, and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives that inspire, uplift, and provoke thought. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and if you believe in the power of storytelling to drive change, give this video a thumbs up and share it with others who need to hear this message. Together, we can build a more just and compassionate world, one story at a time.